Welcome to Delivering Miracles, a podcast to teach women like you tips and strategies on how you can have a safer pregnancy so you can bring home a healthy baby. I'm your host and your high-risk pregnancy expert, Parijat Deshpande. I can't wait to chat with you. Today I want to talk to you about a topic that comes up a lot in my community. And truthfully, it didn't come up right away. When I first started practicing and serving clients and working with clients going through a high-risk pregnancy. And as the business has grown and my community has grown, and I've had the honor of meeting so many new people, this is something that's come up a lot. How do you parent after loss? How do you do it? The number of questions that I get about this is wild. And they range in a lot of different ways. How do I remember the child or children that I've lost? How do I protect my child or children that are living from the pain? How do I talk to them about them? It's how do I really is kind of the umbrella under which there are so many questions. And so I thought I'd take a moment today to talk to you about parenting after loss and how do you do it? Because I think when we talk about loss, we hit up against a lot of issues that our community has around grief. And by community, I mean our larger culture, the larger community that we're a part of. When you experience a loss, especially the loss of a child, you really get to feel and experience firsthand how limited our community and the people around us, how limited the resources are on how to support after a loss. And it's really unfortunate because it leaves you feeling like either you're stuck in the past or you're being ridiculous for not getting over it, or you're not allowing yourself to feel joy because you're stuck back there and you can't get over it or can't move on from it. There's so many awful messages that come up around loss and grief. We have a very low tolerance in our society for grief. I'm just going to say it right there. We have a very low tolerance. We want to get over it. We just want it to be over. Okay, that sucked. Let's move on now. Let's not talk about it. Hey, and when you're dealing with parenting after loss, the focus becomes, hey, well, let's just focus on the kids that are here. And it's not that simple because the life that you are mourning, whether you lost that life 4 weeks into your pregnancy or 4 months into your pregnancy or 4 months after delivery or 4 years later, it doesn't matter. That life was a life, and that life was precious to you. And still, I hear the pressure that you're under. How do I do this? How do I do this? So today, I want to talk to you about parenting after loss. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the basics of grief, because we cannot overstate them. Grief and loss and mourning. We're going to cover that. And I'm going to answer the 3 most common questions that I hear as it pertains to parenting after loss. And we're going to talk about how you navigate this challenging journey, especially when you have messages around you telling you to move on. So let's start there. Are you stuck? Are you not moving on? The answer is no. What you're going to hear in this episode is a lot of, there's no one way to do this, but this part of it, I've got one answer for you, and there's one answer only. You are not being ridiculous. You are not being unreasonable. There's nothing wrong with you for wanting to mourn the child or children that you lost. Ever. No matter how long ago it was. Never. And tied to that, I want you to hear that you can be grateful for the children that you have in your arms while you are still grieving the children that are in your heart. The human body And the human experience is far too complicated for this to be an either or situation. And I know you are hearing the message that it's either or. I heard it. I have friends who hear it. All my clients hear it. But it is not that. It is not that. I know you are grateful for your children that are in your life right now, in your arms. And I know that you are also mourning the loss of the children that you do not get to see grow up. And they both can and do coexist. And anyone that tells you otherwise is projecting their own discomfort of the complexity of grief. And it says nothing about you. Okay? I was talking to a friend a while back about this concept when she was reflecting on grieving the loss of one of her babies while parenting her child that she has in her arms. And she said the most interesting thing to me that I have not forgotten. She said, it feels like I am not allowed to be the mother to both. I mean, I get teary just saying that out loud again. But when I heard it, boy, did that really hit home. Because that's essentially what it is, right? That you are being robbed of that experience when people are pushing you to pick joy, pick gratitude, pick the one that's here, that you can see. And there is no choice. I want you to really hear that. There is no choice. Your motherhood experience of the children that you have in your arms is different than your motherhood experience of the children who you have in your heart. And they both coexist. And it's messy, and it doesn't make sense, and it's complicated. And there are not a lot of people who can tolerate that. And that is the unfortunate truth. So find the people who can. Find the people who can, because they're out there. They're out there. The second piece about grief and loss that I want to cover, and I want to make sure you hear, is that your grief doesn't disappear because you're pregnant again or you've delivered another baby. And I think that's another huge misconception. And I know you know this because you're listening to this episode, probably because you are still mourning one or many losses. And you're probably hearing some kind of message of, move on. It's over. Let's look forward. Let's look to the future. Grief doesn't work that way. And I don't mean that emotionally. I mean that actually biologically. In your body, down to the cellular level, grief doesn't disappear. It doesn't disappear. It needs to be released. And time does not do that, and a new baby does not do that. So if you need to send this portion of the podcast to somebody who needed to hear that, please feel free. Because it doesn't. And so, and I want you to hear this, for you to know it's not you. It's not you being hung up or being stuck in the past or not being able to feel joy for this new baby. And, we'll talk about the nuances of that certainly, but that's not what this is. Going back to the first point, they coexist. Grief and gratitude coexist. Grief and joy coexist. It's messy. It's confusing. And there's all kinds of gray in this situation. That's where we live, in the world of gray. The third piece that I want you to really hear and take home, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that if you don't release the grief, and you don't give yourself the opportunity to release it for any number of reasons, and we're going to get into some of those details, but, it could be due to parenting demands. It can be due to not having enough help. It can be due to pressures to not actually own that and experience that part of your journey or whatever it might be. It doesn't go away. And it sits in the body. And in doing that, what happens is it creates a sense of frozenness in your nervous system. And that has a cascading effect on your health and your ability to parent. So I share that because while we are talking about what to do about this, one of the things that you have to do is you've got to do the work to release it. And the work with grief is you've got to feel it to release it. There's no other way around grief. There's no treatment for grief because it's not a pathological condition. There's no pill for grief that's going to make that easier. Loss, the grief that comes after a loss, and especially one after losing a child, but really just grief in general, physiologically alters your nervous system, which alters your endocrine system, your digestive system, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, your muscular system. It affects all of it. And you've got to release it. Otherwise, those changes cascade into long-term health problems. When we look back and when we look at women who are postpartum, either in the first 12 months, which I think is ridiculous that we call 1 year postpartum, it's longer than that, but whatever. We'll debate that another time. But when you look at women who are either postpartum, so in the first 12 months, or later, and you look at the health complications that they have developed, chronic health issues, chronic pain, chronic inflammation, autoimmune diseases, anything like that, and you do a reverse engineering to see what happened before, you are likely to find at least one episode of a loss that was not resolved. That's how important this work is. So while we are talking about parenting with loss, right? And there are actual constraints that come with doing the work when you have other children to take care of, I want you to hear this piece of how important it is because it affects your health, which will affect your children's health and any future children you may have, and that your healing will also be passed down. The healing doesn't stop with just you. Everybody in your family is going to feel the effects of it, right? So if you're sitting there and you're wanting to do this work, but you're kind of going, yeah, but I've got all these things to do for my children and I'm so busy and this and that, I really want you to hear this. This is not work that you can put off. There are some really serious consequences for that you don't deserve to have, especially after what you've been through. So the biggest issue, right now that we've covered kind of the groundwork for grief. Actually, before I go into the biggest issue, let's just do a little recap of what grief, how it works, how grief works, okay? You experienced a loss, right? And it was undescribably devastating. There's no doubt about it. Perhaps you had support, perhaps you didn't. Perhaps you had the time to grieve, perhaps you didn't. Regardless of the circumstances of how early you lost the baby, how late you lost the baby in life, how it happened, miscarriage, ectopic pregnancy, stillbirth, prematurity, infant death, sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, right? Something else in infancy, a virus that resulted in infant death, whatever it might be, does not matter. The initial loss is like a shock wave, right? Shock wave. And the difference between the loss of anyone else in your life and the loss of a child is it's unnatural, right? Parents are not supposed to outlive their children. And so there's an additional layer of this doesn't make biological sense because this is not how it's supposed to happen. Right? And we can debate all day long about when attachment begins and how early and it doesn't matter. But even the potential of life, which is why we see the same type of experiences for women who lose babies very early in the pregnancy, even as early as 4, 5, 6 weeks, even prior to seeing a heartbeat on the ultrasound, we see a similar type of reaction. It's a shock wave. And it's the wave of trying to make sense of something that's biologically unnatural. Right? And what happens is our body tries to find some safety in that, because what has just happened is life is lost. Therefore, there's a sense of danger, right? That's a biological mechanism that we have. We just lost a life. Who else is in danger? It happens, and it happens outside of our conscious awareness, so there's no thought that's going into this. And so you go into survival mode. And that is where you are meant to be at that time, right? There's nothing wrong with it. There's actually everything right with it. Your body is doing what it's supposed to do at that time. And what happens is grief comes in waves. And you've probably experienced this. At the beginning, you can't even tell that it's waves because they're so frequent. It's like this constant barrage of sadness and shock and anger and so much. And if you allow yourself to feel it, which, let's just stop here for a second and revisit the fact that grief sucks. It sucks and it's painful and it's awful. And there's nothing to sugarcoat that. But if you allow yourself to feel it over time, not because time is passing, but because you are keeping the channels open for the waves to come crashing, you will see a decrease in intensity and frequency of those waves. You don't have to do a thing other than feel it and allow for it to pass. We have this desire to go through that quickly. We have a desire to intervene. We think that because it's so awful, there must be something wrong with us. And it's not. In the early days, it is that awful. Now, I will put a caveat here. If you are thinking about hurting yourself or somebody else, if you're having thoughts of suicide, if you're having thoughts of harming yourself, please take that seriously. Please tell somebody, please call 911 or go to the nearest emergency room or call the suicide hotline. The number is in the show notes. 800-273-TALK. That's what it is. But barring that, grief sucks. It's terrible. And our bodies know how to heal from that. Okay? They know it, our bodies know how to heal. We are designed to heal from grief. And the way to do that is to let the waves come. Now, this is where it gets tricky with parenting, because how are you supposed to do that when you've got little people running around who still need you? So here's what I've got for you for that, which is one of the most common questions that I get. This is a time to call on your supports. You cannot do this on your own, and you should not do this on your own. So reach out to friends, to neighbors, to family members. Allow them to take care of your children so you have time and space to take care of yourself, to feel some of these waves. I worked with a client recently on this specifically. I don't typically do one-on-one work on grief release anymore. The grief release portion of my work has been put into the Healing Hearts program for the most part, but I made an exception for this one woman. And we came up with a lot of different creative solutions for when to give herself the opportunity to grieve. So when you don't have other children or even other responsibilities like work and taking care of the house and anything like that, you can, in the ideal world, you would just be able to ride the wave and feel the wave as it comes. And we also know that in real life, that doesn't happen like that. So for this client in particular, we would talk about when her son would go to preschool, that would be her time for herself to release some of the grief. And sometimes, in the ideal world, that's when the grief would come and she would have the space and the time to deal with it. And then it would just be all self-contained like that. And by the time her son came home, everything would be kind of put back together. And life doesn't work that way. There were mornings when she would wake up and she had to get breakfast ready and pack lunch and get everybody out the door. And that's when the grief would hit. And so if that happens, I'll share with you what I shared with her is to notice that it's happening, right? And if you're not in a place, and this may not have to do with the morning, for you, it might be not within morning routine. It might be you're at work or you're out shopping or you're any place or you're with somebody who's not trustworthy with your emotions, right? We talked about being surrounded by people who can tolerate this, and you might be with somebody who can't tolerate it, and you know that. Whatever it might be, and you're in a situation where you can't allow for that wave, you can't feel that wave, here's what you do. You notice it. You notice that it's coming, right? I find it helpful to actually visualize a wave. Like, oh, there it is. I can see it. I can see the crest forming. It's coming, right? And you probably know what that feels like. Notice where you feel it in your body. Some people feel it as like the burning sensation around the edges of your eyes, right? And it's coupled with maybe your heart sinking or your stomach dropping or a tightness in your belly or a tightness in your jaw, something like that's changing in your body, and your body's giving you a notice that it's coming, right? And you notice it. Notice it. What we tend to do is we go, no, not right now, I can't. Instead, notice it. And you take a deep breath and you relax your shoulders, you drop your shoulders down, and you make a mental note. You look at your calendar or you make a mental note, when can I follow this through? When can I finish this? It might be at the end of the day in the car on your drive home. It might be 2 hours later when breakfast is done and the kids are out the door to school. It might be in 30 minutes. It might be in 5 minutes when you can run to the bathroom. Pick a time and commit to that time and know that that's when you're going to finish that wave. And when that time comes, so for my client, it was once her husband and her son were out the door. That was her time. And we created a ritual for her to get her back to that place. Because what happen sometimes is, oh, good, that's gone. I'm feeling better. I didn't have to deal with it. And now I've got the house to myself. So I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm not going to go back there. And what you've done by doing that is you have frozen that wave mid-wave. And when that happens, that's what we go back to one of those basic tenets of grief that we talked about earlier. It gets stuck in the body, right? So you do have to revisit this. And so for her, we created a sense of ritual around how to get that back to finish it. And if you've been following Delivering Miracles for a while, you know that my approach is very somatic. It's very body-based. So we use body anchors to get her back to that place to finish the wave. Sometimes the waves, there's another one that follows it, and sometimes there's not. You allow your body to do what it needs to do to release, right? And when you can do that, you will see a decrease in intensity and frequency of those waves. What happens usually is we avoid it because we can't, right? We can't because of actual issues in real life where there's no time or space. And by the end of the day, it's 9:30, 10 o'clock. You're exhausted from taking care of everybody. And the last thing you want to do is to feel this. Or it's uncomfortable and we don't want to. And so we shut it off and we don't look at it. Or something else happens and we don't allow the waves to completely finish their cycle, and it gets stuck. So the number one thing I have for you in this situation when you're parenting after a loss is you cannot grieve alone. You can't do this alone. So call on your partner, call on your friends and family, call on your neighbors, ask them to take your children for an afternoon, for an hour even. This doesn't take very long. And give yourself that space to do the work. And if you're somebody who is supporting someone who is parenting after a loss and needs to grieve the loss, this is a great way to help. Take the children for a play date. Have them come over to your house, go see a movie, whatever that might be, to give the parents the opportunity to turn inward and allow the cycles of those waves to complete. The other thing that I find to be helpful is to know your triggers, right? If you know that doing laundry is going to trigger a wave to come back, time the laundry in moments when you know you can allow those waves to complete. Or hand it off completely if you know you're not going to be able to do it right now, or today, or this week, right? Set yourself up so that you avoid the triggers when you cannot allow the wave to complete. Do you hear the whole sentence, right? I want you to hear the whole sentence. I'm not saying avoid triggers completely. I'm saying avoid them until you know that you can allow the wave to complete. Now, you might be wondering, well, what happens if the triggers are constantly bringing up, like there's so many of them, they're everywhere, and the waves are still just coming so strong. One thing I want to remind you of is at the beginning, that is how it is. There's nothing pathological about that. That is how it is. If you are several months out or years out and that is still happening, that is usually a sign that the grief has become stuck. And we've got to what is the word I'm looking for? We've got to unstick it. That's not the word I'm looking for. But we've got to release that. We've got to make it unfrozen so that the waves can continue, right? And if that sounds like what's happening, I really strongly urge you to join us in Healing Hearts, because you can do that, and you can do it very carefully and very safely and very gently without re-triggering yourself, because that's what's happening there. The other piece that I want to share about this is, how do I do this when I've got little people around? And little people who need me to be a functional human being to take care of their needs, right? I will add here that this is also a really great learning opportunity for children to develop emotional intelligence and empathy, no matter how young they are. I see too often, and I think back to my days when I used to work as a child therapist also, we have a tendency to shield our children from our pain because we don't want them to feel sad. We don't want them to feel bad. We don't want them to see mom or dad or whoever crying or being upset or being anything other than happy and joyous and wonderful. And we as adults know that that's not how life is, right? But we want to shield them from that. And here's the thing. In doing that, we forget how resilient children actually are, that they can actually tolerate a lot of big feelings when we model for them how to do that safely, how to do that carefully, how to do that gently, so that, yes, there's a big feeling and we're all okay. So, I hear a lot from women about, well, I don't want my children to see me crying. And so I encourage you to become a little reflective on that. What is it that you're trying to protect your children from? What is it about crying that you don't want them to see? Now, I understand if you're in the middle of, if that wave is pretty intense, you certainly don't want to scare them with how sad you are, how heartbroken you are. Certainly, this does have to be developmentally appropriate. And is there somewhere in there a discomfort of yours that you are putting on your children for wanting to shield them from this? Because you can have some pretty darn amazing conversations with children even as young as 2 and 3, depending on how verbal they are. And even if they're not verbal, they will understand you when you speak to them in a developmentally appropriate way about why your heart's broken, why you're sad, what you're thinking about. And it's a wonderful way to include them in your healing journey, to show them that it's not just heartbreak that you experience, but that you can heal from it too. And that's what you're doing. Another question that I get frequently is, how do I honor the baby or babies that I lost? I especially get these questions from twin moms or triplet moms who have a surviving twin or triplet, but have lost 1 or 2 of their siblings. How do I honor that loss? How do I do birthdays? How do I do that? So let me say this. I'll start here. What is the question inside that question? Because the real answer is you can do it however you want. But it's not that simple, is it? It wouldn't be a question if it was that simple. So my question back, if you're wondering about this, is what's underneath that question? I'll tell you two of the things that I see most frequently from the women I speak with. Maybe they'll resonate with you. Maybe they'll inspire you to think of something else that resonates more. The two things that I see that are kind of underneath, buried in that question, is either a fear of taking something away from the child that's living. Like, am I ruining their birthday by talking about the child that didn't survive? Am I taking something away from them? Am I scarring them? Am I hurting them by making this about the two of them or the three of them as opposed to just this one that survived? And the other one is the fear of not moving on. That what will my family think? What will my friends think? I don't mean that in a self-centered way. I don't think anybody who's thinking that is thinking about this from an image standpoint. But I think it's more of I'm making myself vulnerable by baking 2 cakes or 3 cakes, even though there's only one child here that you can see. And I am trusting that you can tolerate that. But what if you can't, right? Those are kind of the two themes that I see. Maybe those resonate with you. Maybe you're like, it's not quite that, but this is something else. What is that thing? Because like I said, how to honor the loss or how to do birthdays, there's no one way to do it. You do it however you want. But there's another question in there, right? Or there's a fear that's really driving that question. And that's going to be different for each of us. That's going to be different for each of us. What is that for you? And that's going to help you understand what's making this decision difficult or complicated or very nuanced and not easy and firmly planted in the gray, right? Because there is no one way to do this. I'm reminded of when I was in graduate school, we used to have case consultations. So once a week, everybody would come together and we would present a particular case. I hate using that word because people aren't cases, but that's what it was called. And we would talk about a particular client of ours that either we were especially proud of, or we had some wins to celebrate, or we had a question, we weren't sure what to do, something, whichever one it was for the week. And there was a colleague of mine who shared that he had an elderly woman as a client. This is not parenting after loss. She lost her husband. And she was in therapy at the request of her children. And she shared with him that every night she set the table for the two of them. She kept her wedding ring. I think her husband had passed. It had been several years. It wasn't a recent death. And she set the table for the two of them every single night. And her children thought that was weird and like concerning and is mom okay? Like, has she, right? Back to this whole idea of has she moved on or not? And so he presented that case in case consultation that week. And he said, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to tell her because she seems very content and she doesn't seem distressed and she doesn't seem, it makes her happy to set the table and she's completely fine. It's not like she puts food on that plate. It's just there. It's just there and she eats by herself and she eats on her own and it just brings her comfort. And I remember the conversation was so interesting, even amongst clinicians, of what do you do and how do you handle this? And I remember my feeling at the time was if she's content and it's bringing her comfort and it's not hurting anybody and she's still able to function in her day-to-day and live her life with joy and at peace, why does it matter? That was my personal belief. And I believe the same thing about this. If you want to have 2-3 cakes at the birthday party, and that brings you joy, and that brings you a sense of peace, go ahead. If you want to talk about their birthdays, and you talk about the surviving twin or triplet, and you talk about the twin or triplets who did not survive, go ahead. If you want to have their names, all of their names up on the wall, if you want to have their pictures up on the wall, go ahead. If you don't want to do any of that and you want to only do the birthday for the surviving twin or triplet, if you only want to make that day about the one who survived, if you don't want to have any mention of the babies that you lost, go ahead. There's no one way to do this. The only way to do this right is to do what brings you a sense of peace. And what that's going to be is different for everybody. And I realize that's an extremely vague answer, and it's really a non-answer. I get that. But what I want you to hear is the subtext of that, is you can't get it wrong. I think there's a fear, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about it's a learning opportunity for kind of emotional intelligence and empathy. I think there's a fear that we're going to harm our children. We're going to hurt them somehow. And instead, I'd love for you to really see that this is a fantastic opportunity for them to learn about the nuances of real life. And it sucks that they have to learn it so early. It sucks. It's not fair. And that's something that you also have to grieve the loss of. Innocence. And still, if you want to protect that innocence and you want to bring this up later in their life or never at all, that's your choice too. Because I want you to remember that especially when there are twins and triplets, like multiple situations, but true for really all families, there are multiple stories and relationships that are affected, right? It's you as the mother and your children who you lost, the siblings and their siblings who they lost, and of course your partner and their experience too, right? And so you don't have to figure all of it out for everyone right now. It's a dynamic, ever-evolving situation because every year that your child or living children grow, they are going to understand the exact same situation a little bit differently and a little bit differently. Think about it from your own perspective. As you were growing up and you were learning things about your family, you might have learned about some grandparent who passed away when you were like 7 and doing a family tree for school. And then you get back to that, say, 2-3 years later. And suddenly the question isn't just, who is that? What's their name? And you plop it on the tree. But now you're going, what happened? Right? And then a couple years later, you're maybe learning about something in history that affected your family. And you go, oh, was that grandparent there at that time? And you're adding layers to the experience and the story, right? Your living children will do the same thing with regards to the children that you have lost. And again, what I mean by that is every year or every so often with new developmental milestones, they will ask about it from a different angle because they'll be able to understand it at a different level, right? So you actually can't figure it all out right now because next year and 2 years and 5 years from now, their ability to question and understand is completely different than it is at this particular moment, right? And the thing is, if you choose not to say anything at all, that's completely fine too. I know there's a sense of like, well, do I want to hide it from my children? Do I want it to be open? You don't have to decide that right now. You can choose, for now, I'm not going to say anything. And maybe next year, the birthday is going to come around and I'm going to feel like, gosh, maybe this year I want to have 2 or 3 cakes. Or maybe this year I want to tell my child what actually happened on the day of their birthday. And maybe not. Maybe not. It might happen when your children are older. It might happen when your children become parents, or it might not happen at all. You do not have to figure it out right now, but what you do have to do is do the thing that's going to bring you peace. If you lead with that, you won't get it wrong. Truthfully, you won't get it wrong. Because what you're doing is aiding and supporting your healing. And when you are healed, and what is healed really? There's no end point of healing. It's a lifestyle. But when you have kind of gotten to a point where those waves are less intense, less frequent, to the point where you're not avoiding triggers and it's not this day-to-day thing, you're able to make a lot of these decisions differently too. So lead with a sense of peace. Start there. And as you start experiencing that peace more often, physiologically, what's happening is the parts of your brain that are available, that are focused on making decisions and weighing pros and cons, will become more available. And you'll actually be able to make a more informed decision with full capacity, as opposed to trying to figure it out while you're also navigating these intense waves that are coming. Okay. The last piece, kind of the last bucket of questions that I get, is something to the effect of, I experienced a loss, again, whatever type, doesn't matter how early or late in the pregnancy, how early or late in the child's life, and I'm still anxious or terrified that I'm going to lose my living children. And I'm living as if they could leave me too, or they could die at any moment too. And if you resonate with that, I want to say this to you with so much love, that this is not grief. This is trauma. The loss or the losses that you experienced have become encoded in your body as a traumatic loss. And that time will not erase that. More children will not erase that. We've talked about that, right? It's not going to make it better. This is not something you can think yourself out of. This is not something you can say, I just got to be more positive. I just got to look at all, look at my children are getting bigger and they're so healthy, and look at their growth chart and everything's fine. And the doctor's telling me they're fine. Why can't I get this? It doesn't work at that level. Your nervous system has become stuck in a state of survival. And the only way for that anxiety or that fear of, oh my gosh, I might lose my children at any moment, the only way to get rid of that is a terrible way of saying it, but the only way to release that and be at peace and comfortable with the fact that these children are safe now is for you to feel safe in your body first. And so if that sounds like you, I really, really encourage you to watch the Modern Approach to Grief and Trauma Release webinar. It is linked in the show notes so you can understand the physiology of what's happening. And if it resonates, I really encourage you to join Healing Hearts so you can learn how to thaw that nervous system, so to speak, out of that frozen survival state. And in doing that, the grief waves will come, because they do not come when we are living in a state of survival. You thaw the nervous system out of that survival frozenness. The waves of grief will come. You do the grief work to allow those waves to decrease in intensity and frequency, and you will find yourself in a place of peace. I see it every day. I have lived it myself. I have done this work myself as a parent of a child and children after losses. And I know it works. And I know it can work for you too. Going back to that client that I was telling you about, who had the preschooler, we were working together, and that was one of her moments. We did a lot of work together on how to allow for that, for her to experience the waves of grief. And I can tell you that her situation is so similar to what is possible for all of us, that when we actually allow ourselves to feel it, for her, as with most of my clients who I had done this work with before, within 3 to 4 weeks, there's a significant change in the intensity and the frequency of those grief waves, so to speak. And by 8 weeks or so, usually there's a tremendous change. It goes from the norm is grief waves, and I'm just trying to keep my head above water, to the waves come, but they are not the majority of my day. And it works. It does work. But as the parent of living children, you've got to give yourself and create that opportunity to do the work. Too often I see especially those of us who are mothers, especially after losses, when we feel like we should be doing everything for our children who are here and we are indebted to them, or we are responsible, or only I can do this and nobody else can do this. And we convince ourselves we can't take that time and space to do the work. When the reality is that in doing the healing, we're actually healing the whole family. Now, I hate saying that because it feels like a huge burden that if I don't do it, nobody else will. It's not in that way. I'm mostly just trying to explain to you that the healing doesn't stop with you, that everybody's going to benefit when you do the work for yourself. And so it's really important that you prioritize this and create the time and space. And what I mean by that too is surrounding yourself with people who can tolerate your reality, who can really tolerate the confusion and the complexity of what it means to honor your children who you will never see growing up, while also being so thrilled for the children you do have who are living with you. This is a great opportunity to do an audit of your situation and find those people who can support this work and support you as you are going through this journey. It is a journey, and it sucks, and it's so heartbreaking, and it is so sad, and I wish nobody knew the pain of losing a child, no matter how early in that child's life they were gone. I wish you didn't know it. I'm sorry that you're here. And if you're listening to this episode, I hope that what you're taking away from this is that you will heal. And in healing, really what that means is remembering those babies in your heart without pain, without a feeling like you're being sucked back to that moment, and with choice, that I can call upon that memory and I can think about that child or those children whenever I want. And sure, every time I do, I may still have tears. But there's a difference between having tears from a relaxed body where those tears feel like a release every single time versus having those tears because it feels too much. That first experience that I just talked about, when you can feel and have those tears, and you still feel the sadness, of course, but it's from a relaxed body and you feel nothing but this bursting of love. That's healing. That's what we mean by healing. And it is possible for you too. I hope you have found this episode helpful. Thank you so much for joining me here. If you have had any insights or breakthroughs or something in this episode really stuck with you, please take a screenshot of this episode and share it with me on Facebook or Instagram. I am at healthy.highriskpregnancy on Instagram. I am at Parijat Desh, Parijatdesh on Facebook. And be sure to tag me and let me know what that thing was. I would love to know what's resonating with you. And like I said, if you are doing this work and you are trying your hardest and it is just not helping to do it on your own, and you want to learn how to reset your nervous system to really safely and easily and gently release the grief from your body, I would love for you to join us in Healing Hearts. That link is in the show notes as well, and you're welcome to join us and join a community of women from around the world who are dedicated to remembering those children that are in their hearts from a place of love instead of pain, and really leading the charge on healing and allowing themselves to heal from the losses that they have incurred in a safe community. So we would love to have you there. It's awful. I mean, there are no words. There are no words. When you lose a child, there are no words that make it better. There are no words that ease the pain. There are some things that you just cannot put words to. And so I leave you with this. Allow your heart to be filled with that love that you have for that child or those children. And know that if you lead from a place of what brings you peace, you will honor those children in the way that they deserve and the way that you want. And your living children and your other family members will pick up on it as well. And peace is possible, no matter how much your heart has shattered. I promise you peace. Finding peace and living in peace is possible. Take it one day, one step at a time. You can do this.